City of Stevens Point Housing Task Force meeting, recorded November 17, 2021.
All right, well, in the respect of time, it is 3:15, so thank you all for coming, and we'll commence the Housing Task Force meeting for today. Brian, do you want to take a roll call for us?
I've just been marking folks as they come in, but we do have a quorum. I will note that Chris Gleismith and Mike Wiesa are excused.
Excellent. All right, well, we have a relatively short agenda today, but substantial nonetheless. And so we have a presentation and discussion from Iru Odedusu from the Housing Authority. And I'll turn it over. She's got the screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone. My name is Ido Odedusu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stevens Point Housing Authority. So Stevens Point Housing Authority, we're a public housing agency. So we're federally funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most of our funds, if not all of our funds, are administered federally. We were formed officially in 1968. So our mission for public housing and most public housing agencies across the United States is to provide quality, affordable, and safe housing for low to moderate income individuals and families within the city of Stevens Point.
I'm going to pause it. It changed on our screen here, but it did not change on our screens in person. So maybe I'm wondering if I still need to do it on this computer. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah, no worries. Just sneak in here real quick.
Oh yeah, and then I can click through the...
See if this works. And then you should be able to, oops. Okay, then you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay.
Oh yeah, here we go. There was too many presentations.
Okay, perfect. So we manage 247 units within Stevens Point. We have three kind of areas we manage. So first is High Rise Manor, which is a 7-story building located at 1300 Briggs Court in downtown Stevens Point. So that particular complex includes 73 one-bedroom apartments. All utilities are included. We also have laundry facilities on site, and it's also on the City of Stevens Point bus route as well. Another highlight about that particular building is that it's wheelchair accessible apartments are available, and there's also accessible showers in all apartments. And we have a dining room and community room with cable TV service. So that's just one highlight of one of the buildings that we manage. Another complex that we manage is Madison View Apartments. So that's 93 apartments. They range in size from 1 bedroom to 7 bedrooms, and it's located on Johns Drive. As that particular complex is also located on the City of Stevens Point bus route. All utilities are included. There's laundry facilities on site. And in the summertime, you work at Boys and Girls Club, we operate a summer-only day camp, which is operated by the Boys and Girls Club of Portage County, and that's in our non-residential unit at that complex. In addition, we have scattered family homes. So this consists of 80 single-family, duplex, and fourplex scattered homes that are scattered throughout the City of Stevens Point. And at these homes, utilities are not included, but a utility allowance is given to the tenants to be able to cover gas and electric. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation on how that works. And then all of those units include basement with laundry hookups, and is also near public transportation routes as well. So this is the entire portfolio of all the units that we manage within the City of Stevens Point. We don't manage any units outside of the city. So one thing I want to just give a quick overview of public housing, because I think some people understand public housing, but then they also don't understand it at the same time. So just wanted to give a quick overview of public housing. So the U.S. Housing Act of 1937 established permanent public housing, which is funded by the federal government. So the following programs for public housing today, there's more than what's listed here, but these are some of the big programs. Is low rent public housing, which is considered Section 9. Most people don't know it as Section 9. They just know it as traditional public housing. And a lot of people are familiar with housing choice vouchers, which is the Section 8 voucher program, which allows low-income and moderate-income people to rent in the private sector. We don't manage any Section 8 vouchers. There's another entity that we sometimes get confused with, but it's called the Portage County Housing Authority, and they're the entity locally that manages Section 8 vouchers for the entire county. There's Choice Neighborhoods, which is to revitalize distressed neighborhoods across different parts of the U.S., and there's RAD, which is the Rental Assistance Demonstration, which converts traditional public housing into project-based Section 8. So today, what I'm going to highlight is just the traditional public housing, the units that we manage, but just wanted to highlight that there are other forms of public housing, and I know a lot of people are familiar with Section 8. So just wanted to just explain the differences between Section 8 and Section 9, which we manage.
Do you know if there are any of the options 3 and 4, you said the county manages number 2, that are within the county?
I'm not as familiar with choice neighborhoods. I know choice neighborhoods exist in a lot of bigger cities. I'm not sure if there's any, because that's a grant. HUD administers a grant, and is a competitive grant that public housing agencies would bid for.
Okay.
And they will win. And rental assistance demonstration, I know that in Wausau, they've converted some of their traditional public housing into project-based Section 8.
Okay.
So public housing overall was established to provide safe and decent rental housing for low-income families, the elderly, and people with disabilities. That's the purpose of affordable housing or public housing in the United States. So nationwide, and some people are familiar, may not be familiar, but public housing actually provides housing for 970,000 households live in public housing units, and this is across the United States, and they're managed by 3,300 public housing agencies, and that number fluctuates because some housing agencies consolidate with other agencies. And another thing that some people are not familiar with is that there's public housing exists in all 50 states and U.S. territories. So there's public housing in Puerto Rico, there's actually public housing in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So across every city, every county usually has public housing units to be able to serve low-income populations. So how is public housing funded? I think this is always good to highlight, is that the two main sources of public housing funding is through our operating fund. So we receive operating funds every year from HUD, which covers the gap between the rents that public housing tenants pay and then actual operating costs to operate those units. So every year has a complicated formula that they use to allocate operating funds to all public housing agencies nationwide. In addition to operating funds, we also receive capital funds, and as the name implies, that's to provide necessary renovations, such as heating. Recently, we put new roofs at our Madison View complex. So those, just anything that's capital related, HUD provide. Those are the two main buckets of funds for traditional public housing. Another thing to note is that all of this is appropriated by Congress. It goes down through legislation, federal budget, then the HUD budget, and then the HUD distributes those funds to public housing. So, I know we're not an advocacy group, but, if we wanted to increase more affordable housing, one way is to do that legislatively and advocate for more funding for affordable housing, because all of that is decided in D.C. and then is administered locally through the states and the counties. So public housing eligibility. So public housing is available to all individuals and families who meet the guidelines set by HUD. So income eligibility can't exceed 80% of the area median income for the county. So these are the current maximum annual incomes based on household size. For example, a one person, the maximum that they can make is $45,050. A two-person household, $51,450, and it increases from there. And this is, like I said, 80% of the area median income for Portage County. And every year HUD updates those numbers. If you go to their HUD website, you just Google the area median income for any county nationwide, and you'll obtain that number. So one thing I also want to highlight is that public housing is affordable housing, and this is one of the main benefits of public housing, that is income-based rent, which normally does not exist in the private market, and why public housing is very important, especially for low to moderate income individuals. In public housing, tenants pay no more than 30% of their income after certain deductions are taken out for rent and or utilities, or a flat or ceiling rent, whichever is lower. And I'll kind of explain flat and ceiling rent in a little bit. The minimum rent, for example, if someone isn't working or if they have very low income, the minimum rent for public housing is $50. And the flat rent, which is the maximum rent that anyone will pay that lives in public housing, is equal to 80% of HUD's fair market rent for Portage County. So, for example, the maximum rent for a one-bedroom within for our public housing units will be $523 in 2022, two-bedroom $675, a three-bedroom $874. And this is for our high-rise and Madison View complexes, and utilities are included at those two complexes. At our scattered site family homes, since they do live in individual homes, we do give a utility allowance because tenants are required to pay their own utilities. So for example, in a two-bedroom, they will receive $101, which is subtracted from the flat rent. So their flat rent would actually be slightly lower because it's taken into account a utility allowance that's given to that particular household. So their flat rent will be, for next year, it's going to be $574 for a two-bedroom, a three-bedroom $763, and it increases from there. So these are the maximum rents that a tenant would pay if they live in public housing. The average rent, however, is $279 because it's based on their income. Public housing is income-based rent, so they only pay 30% of their income on rent. So that's why it's a very important segment of the market that we need more of, frankly. So a good demographic snapshot of public housing in Stevens Point. So this is for the profile for all the families that live in our unit. So currently we have 236 households. I think there's currently 10 who are in the process of lease up, or we're trying to find new tenants because the previous tenants moved out. And this represents 498 individual tenants. So we have 236 current households who are leased up and 498 individual tenants. Most of our tenants are female, so 58% of all of our tenants are female, 42% are male. Elderly, one thing to note is that most of our population includes families, so we have 12% that are elderly, 88% that are non-elderly, and this is for all of our tenants, not just the head of households. And for disabled, we have 25% that are disabled and 75% who are non-disabled. So we serve a variety of different populations within our units. The average age for the head of household, which is the person who actually signs the lease, is 47, but the average age for all of our tenants, which includes the family members that live within our units, is 28. And a good point to note is that the average income is $14,678. So we're serving low-income individuals and a segment, I guess, of the market that if they didn't have public housing, they'll likely be rent burdened if they had to go into the private market because they don't have necessarily sufficient income to meet the market, to be able to afford the market rent that exists currently.
Is that average income of the household or of the individuals?
Of individuals. Of individuals. And then the medium income is 11,005. Sometimes I feel like it's good to highlight medium income as well. And the average rent, which I mentioned before, is $279. So which shows you, it's hard, I'm sure most people pay way more than that in rent. So it's hard to find that if they were to leave and go into the private market. So that's why public housing is just a very needed entity, not locally and just across the United States in general. Another thing is that we do serve a lot of people with families. So all of 236 households, 108, 46% has children, and the total number of children that live within public housing is 210. So this represents 42% of all of our tenants are children.
Do you have a waiting list?
Yes, I'm going to highlight that. Yes, that's a good point. So just the application process. So the main thing is that, if people are interested, they need to submit an application and all the required supporting documentation. They can mail it in, they can fax it, or hand it in person. Once an application is submitted, they're placed on the waiting list based on the time and date the application is submitted. So one thing I really want to point out is that public housing is not immediate or emergency housing. Most, if not all, public housing agencies here in Stevens Point and across the U.S., they manage a waiting list. Our wait list time is between 6 months to over 2 years, depending on the number of individuals that are in that household. So we do encourage people to apply, put their name on the waiting list, but it's not, unlike the private market, you won't apply and move in next week. There is a waiting period because the demand exceeds the supply of available housing units that we have. So when the applicant's name is reached on the waiting list, we'll call them for a phone interview and proceed with all the necessary documentation that they need to be able to move in. So one thing I want to highlight is the benefits of public housing overall. So the nation's public housing is a vital source of stable, affordable homes for more than 900,000 low-income households, and this is a nationwide number. And a large majority of those people, kind of have I mentioned in the previous slides, live below the poverty line. So it definitely helps families afford housing and avoid homelessness and housing instability. Rent is always affordable, so rent is always set at 30% of adjusted gross income. When someone's income decreases, and this is one of the big benefits of public housing, their rent can also be adjusted downward anytime throughout the year to reflect. So, for example, in COVID, there was a lot of people who lost their jobs. So they would come in, our occupancy specialists will review, those new income changes, and their rent would be adjusted downwards to reflect a lower income. So that's one huge benefit of living in public housing that, people who live in private market would not be able to do. Your rent stays the same no matter what, if you lose your job or you stay with the same job. For all public housing properties, utilities are included or utility allowances given. So I mentioned we have 2 of our complexes where all utilities are included, and in our family homes, a utility allowance is given for people to pay their own gas and electric bill. And it provides housing to eligible households whose needs are not met by the market. Like I mentioned, our average income is around $14,000. So this is a segment of the population that wouldn't be able to afford the rents that are in the private market. So some of the challenges of public housing, and you mentioned that when you mentioned that is not immediate housing, there is a wait list. So we currently have 173 people on our wait list. It is documentation heavy. So we require birth certificates, social security cards, income verification, official IDs. We do a criminal history screening. So there's a lot of documentation that's required. And this is something that's also required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. because we have to follow their rules since we're federally funded by HUD. Also, HUD requires all public housing tenants to recertify their income annually. So once you live in public housing, once you get in, you submit all this documentation when you get in, and every year you also need to resubmit your income information because your new income is going to be used to determine your rent for that upcoming year or for the next 12 months. One challenges is obviously some concentrated poverty. This exists in complexes or buildings versus mixed income housing. I'm sure if people are familiar with public housing, you've probably read that, concentrated poverty, there's pros and cons regarding that versus mixed income housing, which is kind of the new wave where it's mixed income in terms of low income housing tax credits and you're mixing market rate with low rent as well. So concentrated poverty does have some challenges. Sometimes in some neighborhoods there's crime or there's things that people shouldn't be doing. But that doesn't necessarily, one good thing is that within the city we do have our scattered family homes as well. So that helps make sure that there are people that live throughout the city and not just at one place. There's misconceptions of individuals and families who reside in public housing. Most people are working families. They may work but may not make sufficient income, but they're working families. They're regular individuals and families who want to earn a living and just need an affordable place to live. But I know there are some misconceptions about people who live in public housing. But a majority of the people who live are just hardworking individuals who use, and some people also use this as a next step. You have some people who use public housing as a place to maybe afford their next home because it's affordable and they're able to save money because they're not paying like 50 or 60% of their income on rent. And one thing that I would say in terms of people and how you can help is encourage people to apply. We have our application on our website. We could always come into our office at 1300 Briggs Court. Encourage people to apply, especially people that are house burdened and they're paying a sufficient amount of money on rent. Definitely apply, even though we don't have a waiting list. We'll eventually even though we do have a waiting list, we will eventually get to their number. But just encourage people to apply and put their name on the waiting list. Help people gather their necessary documents because, like I mentioned before, public housing and anything that's federally administered requires a lot of documentation, and sometimes those are challenges where people may not have their birth certificates or their social security card, and that kind of just holds up the process. So just helping people, making sure they have all their necessary documentation can be really helpful. And even though we don't manage Section 8, that's Portage County Housing Authority, one thing I would say is encourage landlords, if you do know people who are landlords or who have the privilege of being able to rent units, encourage them to participate in the Section 8 program because it's similar to public housing where those tenants also don't pay no more than 30% of their income on rent. The difference is that they're just living in the private landlord system. So that's what I would say in terms of just trying to see how you can help individually, or if you know organizations where they could just promote, just give out information to people about living in public housing, or if someone is seeking affordable housing, just inform them that there is affordable housing locally. It is not immediate, but eventually will reach their number on the waiting list. And this is just my contact information. If anyone has any questions, please definitely go to our website. You could always call me or email me as well, but we also have a good amount of information listed on our website, including our application, if there are any individuals who are interested in income-based rent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any immediate thoughts or questions they'd like to bring up?
I do.
Okay.
Tiffany,
What are the barriers?
sorry, I'm gonna bring the microphone up there so we can pick you up.
Okay.
You guys get to go up and down. Thank you.
Unless you want to sit at the front.
Yeah, you can also sit
wanna
over
do
there.
that.
We can do this right here. What are the barriers for people being able to get in? Because I've had people on the waiting list and wait for a year and a half and then get to the final end and then be denied. So I'd like to know what the barriers are.
Yeah, so we definitely, so one of the barriers could be sometimes criminal history. So we do use internally, we do have a system that runs like a background check on all individuals. For example, if someone is like on a sexual offender list, lifetime, that's an automatic denial. If they're committed of doing certain types of drugs or selling drugs or in the past 3 years, those are also certain denials. And then just getting their documentation. But if someone has a clean background, they would pass that screening. But sometimes the hurdles are that we face is when people don't pass that initial screening. But they could always do a grievance. That's for anyone who's denied, they could always do a grievance, and we could always take a second look if it's something that comes up in their criminal history that prevents them from moving on to the next step.
Is that background check done right away when they first apply to get on the wait list, or is that waited till they've gone through that whole process and then right at the end
So
the
once
background check's done?
When they first apply, their name is put on the waiting list because we don't have immediate. And then once their name is reached on the waiting list, then that's when we start the process of background screening, collecting, or verifying the documentation that they submitted. So that's closer to the time when their name is reached on the waiting list, not at the time of submitting the application.
Gotcha. So is that kind of what you were talking about, Tiffany, that it'd be better to screen them right at the very beginning so they didn't wait 2 years to find out they wouldn't qualify? Okay.
Earlier screen.
Yeah, we don't screen at the beginning. We screen once they're, because we know that time period could last, and there could be other things that come up, so we kind of wait until it's time to lease up when we start all the different screening criterias. And it's one thing to note is that some people think that we're making up like, oh, these are your special rules. No, these are rules that are from U.S. Housing and Urban Development. So all public housing agencies have to follow them. So sometimes those are misconceptions that applicants would think like, oh, you're specifically trying to deny me housing. It's like, no, we have to follow rules where we administer federal funds. So HUD has a list of different rules that public housing agencies have to follow. And certain things are automatic denials depending on the seriousness of the crime.
Evictions?
Huh?
Evictions?
No, evictions are not, especially if it's like based on rent, because I know sometimes people are evicted because they couldn't afford the rent, and we say, well, that's why public housing exists, so you can have rent that's based on your income. So that's not an automatic denial.
Do applicants know the criteria when they apply? So that if I went to apply and it's like no drug convictions last 3 years, and I'm like, I got one, I don't want to waste my time, or do they not know that in advance?
No, I wouldn't say applicants know the full criteria. We try to encourage people to apply because it's kind of like every applicant is like a snowflake. It's different. We have to evaluate each person individually. So what we do is tell people, if you meet the income eligibility, submit the application. Because even if someone is denied, they can always request a grievance. And that just taking a second look at their application, that's an opportunity for them to come into the office, explain their situation. Maybe they committed a crime, but it was 20 years ago. So we may take a second look at that because that took place such a long time ago. So we always tell people just to apply and don't use things that happened in the past to screen yourself out.
Are you familiar with the Rent Ready program in town?
Yes, I'm a little.
So would those applicants qualify if they had something that was, let's say something that would have normally screened them out? If they've gone through that program, would that allow them on the list, or is there not a lot of latitude with HUD for that stuff?
No, some people will, but there's certain things, like definitely if someone's the lifetime sex offender registry, those are automatic. That one I know is an automatic denial, and currently HUD hasn't changed those rules on that. And if it's drug related, it depends on what type of and what time frame those offenses existed. So there's a couple of things that are automatic, but a lot of things are not necessarily automatic denials. We kind of look at the whole picture.
Gotcha.
Melissa has had her online hand up. Go ahead, Melissa.
Okay.
Thanks. Great presentation and very informative. I've been on council for 6 years, and it's the first I've learned about this. So this is an amazing bit of information. And I want to kind of get back on and Travis, I recognized your voice. So what he's talking about is there, I guess my question was, and one of the questions I have listed here, is there an easy to use guide for folks to help them understand, when and if they could be excluded, so that they don't spend 2 years finding out that they don't qualify? So that I think having something that's easy to follow, and maybe having, I don't know if you have advocates that help them complete all that paperwork, because that can be daunting as well. So I think where Travis was headed with that, I think is really something I had noted here. But one of the questions I had relates to, you had said that rents are these can be transitions. So people going from either homelessness or marginal housing to, Section 9 housing and transitioning maybe into something else. So my question is, are any of these rents reported to credit agencies so that people can kind of rebuild their lives and maybe move on to something better after their economic situation changes?
Yeah, so we do have a third-party company that people can pay their rent. It's called Zago. And then through that particular platform, if they choose to, they could sign up to have their rent reported to a credit agency. But that's an opt-in feature if they're using the Zago platform to pay their rent.
And I have one more question. And I don't know if you have this statistic. You had talked about average income, and you talked that most are, working poor. Do you have the statistics on how many people are actually employed and what their average wages are, and if they have any benefits associated with their jobs?
Yeah, we do have that internally. I don't have that right away at my fingertips, but a good majority of our tenants work. We also have a good amount as well that receive fixed income, such as Social Security. But I could get that data for you, but I just don't have it currently.
Sure. No, I didn't expect you to have it at your fingertips, but it just kind of drills down into the data and helps to give a little bit better picture of people who are working and making minimum wage. If that's a big part of that, then that kind of relates to yet another topic that we should be having a conversation about as well. So thanks for the presentation and the response to the questions.
Thank you.
I was wondering if there's a federal average or guideline for a desired wait time on the wait list, and then maybe internally, like what your wait time, your goal is, and is there a need to acquire more housing units to fulfill that, or how are you guys feeling about the acquisition of properties that you have?
Yeah, I would definitely say, like, here within Portage County, our wait list isn't too bad, I would say, compared to, I know, in larger cities where the wait list can be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. And the wait list does move when people, obviously, some people move out, maybe they get a new job or they buy their own house. So it does move. It's not something that stays stagnant, but it is something that, people have to be a little bit patient. It's not, and that's the case even sometimes with Section 8 as well, or with public house or other public housing in other cities or other nearby counties. They just have to wait, and that's just kind of the process. And, we would like to see the wait for the people that are 24 months. We would like to see that, definitely decrease. But we do have some people who, apply last year and then will reach their waiting list, at the top of the following year. So which in the scheme of public housing is not long at all.
Yeah, a whole year.
That triggered another question for me. Do you have to live in Stevens Point to be able to apply, or are people applying from out of the area?
People can apply from anywhere. So public housing is not limited to just people who live within the city of Stevens Point. Anyone can apply. They just have to meet the income eligibility. And that's the case for all public housing. Some public housing have preferences. Obviously, we have a general waiting list. We don't necessarily give preferences to certain individuals. Like sometimes some housing agencies will have like a homeless preference or a family preference. But we decided internally we'll do a general waiting list to just base it on the date and time an application is submitted.
So I have a question you might not have the answer to. So Indiana Street Apartments, is that Section 8, is that Portage County housing? Do you know what I'm talking about, the Indiana Street Apartments? Anybody know?
That's.
Do you know the
that's
address?
Private, yeah.
That's private?
Managed through a private organization that does more of the Section 8 through the county.
Okay, so that's Section 8, so that would be public county, okay.
Yep.
Do we know any, do we have any idea of how many Section 8 housing units there are in Stevens Point?
That's available on HUD's website. I don't know it off my head,
Okay.
but it is available publicly.
Because I just want to, this is not so much a question as, I just want to name that you have 273 units? Was that, am I remembering?
274 units and one is non-residential, so 275, yeah.
Okay. And then we have all those Section 8, and there's at least one whole complex of apartments that I know of. And we have a waiting list of up to 2 years. Right? And then we also have people who aren't applying because they can't wait 2 years. So I just want to name that.
There's 199 active housing vouchers, according to
Yeah, thank you.
Google them.
I will say, when we were going through the, well, we still are going through the drawdown of Edgewater Manor, the waiting list at the City Housing Authority and the County Housing Authority did present a barrier to getting those tenants relocated, which kind of dives into another question of, you know, I think to this group, a 2-year waiting list is, you know, probably unacceptable, but recognizing that there's only so many units within the housing authority, the city housing authority, what are the barriers to constructing or converting existing housing stock or constructing new housing stock for more of the housing authority's purview, the Section 9 housing?
Yeah, so one factor is that HUD does have a fair cloth limit for each housing agency. I think for us it's maybe 276, we manage 246, so within that we probably could have like room for 20 more units in terms of what HUD would actually fund. So every housing agency across the United States has a maximum number of units that HUD would allocate funding for. But I know separate from public housing, one way to get creative with affordable housing is through the low-income housing tax credit model and WIDA financing. We actually used WIDA financing 15 years ago for high-rise tax credit, and that was more to just do updates and renovations to our buildings. But just on a larger scale, I think that's one way to increase affordable housing is to have just more mixed income housing projects, and that's usually available through like the low income housing tax credit, the tax credit model. But that's one limitation in terms of building new housing is that HUD does set a maximum number of units that they will fund for each public housing agency.
Could, and this might be a better question for like the actual administration of HUD, but could the municipality, i.e. the city, pay for these types of capital improvements out of the housing authority to construct more low-income housing instead of using HUD funding, use the HUD model in those units, but construct it using, you know, monies from rent paid from other tenants or whatever else to construct new housing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely creative ways. I know I went to the Wisconsin Association of Housing Authorities conference back in September in Oshkosh. They're doing something creative with, I believe, like tiny homes, and they're getting creative with it's a private entity that's actually funding that initiative. They're not actually using HUD funds. So there are definitely some housing authorities that get creative in how they receive funding, especially because HUD is only going to give you a limited amount. But yeah, there are definitely ways that we could collaborate and brainstorm on different types of initiatives. I know like tiny homes, and that's becoming like a bigger bigger thing now.
I think Melissa had her hand up first, so go ahead. I'll wait for you.
Lisa.
Thank you. I guess, again, I am going back to this, and maybe I'm thinking about this, it's kind of outside the purview of this task force, but there's an interrelationship here, it seems, because if we have people who are working and only making a marginal amount of money, and then we're just saying, let's look at more housing opportunities, which makes sense. We need people to have roofs over their heads. But, that intersectionality, that interrelationship between wages for people who are working and their inability to afford rent, I'm not sure how we solve that puzzle, but it seems to be a very strong connection between, how do we look at creating opportunities for upward mobility for folks so that they can move on from subsidized housing, because clearly folks who are on Social Security disability and Social Security with fixed incomes, their need is probably equally as pressing, but they don't have the opportunities for upward mobility. So again, it's more of a comment, and I'm not sure how we tease that out, but it seems so connected here. So thank you.
If someone is denied or they need emergency housing, where do you refer them to?
Yeah, so for emergency housing, we usually refer them to Salvation Army. I know there's also the Family Crisis Center locally as well, if they're in need for like housing right away. And if someone's denied, they'll get a reason why they denied. And like I mentioned before, they could always request the grievance hearing if they want to, present their case. And a lot of times that someone will probably be related to something based on their criminal history usually. But they could always present their case, and we could take a second look at it.
So I guess my question, I'm kind of fascinated with the whole concept of vouchers, because it seems to potentially have the ability to answer questions of, how do you speed up the process of getting people into housing, and if someone in particular has a temporary need because of an income gap, it sounds like vouchers would help them shop around and be able to consider perhaps market rate housing that they might not otherwise be able to get into. You said to encourage landlords to work or accept voucher aid payments, or just vouchers in general. Could you talk a little bit more about what some of those concerns are, and is the voucher program perhaps a good way to get people into housing?
Yeah, and like I said, we don't manage Section 8 in turn, but I do, Section 8 has a lot of similarities to traditional public housing. And I know sometimes there's some misconceptions of people who have Section 8 vouchers. They're not going to keep the apartment maybe neat. They're not going to pay their rent. But those are a lot of misconceptions. Most people who live in public housing or who have Section 8 vouchers, they pay their portion of the tenant rent on time. So I think one way to encourage landlords is just kind of to explain the overview of how Section 8 works, what's the purpose of Section 8 is to provide housing to people who need it. And another good thing about Section 8 is that there's the tenant share that the tenant is required to pay, and then the housing authority, like for example, Portage County Housing Authority will pay their share as well. So every month it's a guaranteed rent that they're receiving, at least from the housing authority side of it, and then the tenant is responsible for paying their rent. So one also good thing about landlords who rent through Section 8, a good portion of the monthly rent is guaranteed by the federal government. So they don't have to worry about, a tenant not paying rent. Obviously, the tenant still has to pay their portion, but at least the portion that the housing authority pays is guaranteed. So that's, one way to also explain to landlords that at least a portion of their rent is going to be received every month. And just dispel the misconceptions. Most people are hardworking. It's kind of like Melissa said, a lot of people have jobs, but they may not have high-paying jobs, and they're just looking for an affordable place to live.
If you don't mind, I'll throw in the landlord perspective here on that one.
Okay. Do you rent to Section 8?
Don't shoot the messenger, but I would say that the stumbling blocks from a landlord's perspective is twofold. Number one, while it does appear on the surface that it's guaranteed income, it's not, because at any point in time, the housing authority can pull that funding from them should the tenant do something wrong. Say they don't report a job, and all of a sudden they pull that, and now the landlord's stuck in a lease with somebody who does not qualify. But probably the biggest stumbling block that I see with it is the strings that kind of come with it. I feel like that program would be far greater accepted if with the HUD funds just went to the tenant instead of trying to tie the lease up too. Because what happens is when you accept somebody from Section 8, it comes with all these strings of you need to sign these addendums. Our lease now supersedes your lease, landlord. Anything that's conflicting, we now, as HUD, win. It's these extra strings, I think, that keep people from doing that, where I kind of feel like if they could tighten up some of that stuff, you'd see a lot more people jumping on board with that. And I don't know if that's something you can do or if that's a federal thing and there's not a thing any of us can do about it. But that is probably the one thing that scares people a lot on is that well, I kind of lose control of the lease of my property the minute I try to take one of these people, not one of these people, would take one of these vouchers.
Yeah, and HUD, like when Section 8, they make those rules just to make sure that, because sometimes people would rent to Section 8 and may feel like, oh, they don't need to keep it up to a certain standard because these are low to moderate income areas. So those rules are just meant in place to make sure that the housing is kept in good condition, repairs are being done on a needed matter. It is a lot of documentation. I mentioned that in my presentation as one of the challenges of public housing that's federally funded. There's a lot of documentation, and with that includes a lot of paperwork.
And I honestly have no issue with the inspections and the habitability of the building. That's a good thing. It was, for me, it was more the lease end and the legal end of it that it really ties your hands by saying, hey, if you want to accept these funds, we now essentially control your lease, and anything in our documents supersedes your actual lease, landlord. And that's the kind of stuff I think that people are a little less interested about. I don't feel like there's a flexibility. I feel like if the program could have some more flexibility, you'd see more of that. Like, I don't get a lot of people who we can use because we end our leases on the 25th of the month because we need a week to turn over our housing to have it ready to go for the next month. HUD won't allow that. They will not allow that. They said, no, that lease has to run through the end of the month. I'm like, well, then it leaves us no time to turn that unit over and make it presentable for the next tenant. And those are strings I think we see.
Yeah, and I know some, and like I said, I'm not versed in like Section 8, but I know some housing authorities have gotten creative with how to encourage more landlords to participate. They've done like landlord bonuses, or if a tenant doesn't pay their portion, just making sure that on the income side, on the rent side, they're still receiving their rent. So there are creative things that some of the regulations that is required, not so much we could do, but there are creative things such as like landlord bonuses and other incentives to encourage landlords to participate in the program. And in terms of people not following up, obviously there are some tenants who may not do all they're required, but that's a very small percentage of the population. Most people who have Section 8, they're trying to maintain that Section 8 voucher. So they're usually, following up, doing all the necessary things that they need to do so that they don't lose their Section 8. But obviously there are, a segment of the population who may not do all the necessarily follow-up that they need to do to maintain their Section 8, but I would say that's not the majority of people. But yeah, housing authorities like Portage County, if they want to, probably could get creative with like landlord bonuses and other incentives in lieu of the documentation and all the paperwork that HUD requires.
Can I go just a different direction and actually go right back to where Melise was at, but maybe the opposite way she was going? I know she was talking about the wages and versus the rent. What happens with, like in our current climate where wages are skyrocketing right now? What happens when these people make too much and they're currently living in a house? do they
I
get
was gonna
kicked
ask
out?
the timeline.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so HUD does have this Hotma Rule, which is not finalized yet. So what, in that case, they'll pay, so there's two options. They could pay their flat rent, and if the income it really exceeds the maximum allowed, they could also pay market rent. But the new Hotma rules, which will be final, is that if they have, I believe, 24 months of consecutively having high rent, they have two options. They could either move out or pay just market rent, which is the market rent for the county. So those are the two options. But we, to tell you the truth, we don't really face that too much internally.
I just really wonder with where wages are going if we'll see more of that. But I guess I don't. Maybe this sounds cold-hearted, but I would almost think that once they've maxed out that rent, they should be encouraged to move out to open that spot up for somebody who needs it again, rather than just staying there and paying market rent and occupying a property that somebody else could use.
Yeah, and then we have, so for example, there's the HURA home ownership reserve account. So we're trying to encourage that more, let people know about CAP services like down payment assistance for people who do have higher incomes. So like we try to promote it in our newsletters, and we'll continue to promote it. So for people who do have higher incomes and who are ready to take the next step, maybe they could look into like home ownership, because you're already paying the maximum rent. So maybe the maximum rent you're paying may not be too different from the mortgage, that if you were interested in home ownership. So that does, that's a very, very small percentage, I guess, of our population. So we don't face that too much. But when we do come across that, we'll then try to promote home ownership as much as we can.
Okay. I have a question regarding acquisition of properties. I guess it's kind of twofold. How do you typically go about acquiring properties? Is it construction? Do you purchase existing? And when was the last time, I know there's a threshold you can't exceed, it sounded like, but when was the last time that the Housing Authority actually acquired more properties?
It's been a while. We've maintained our current housing portfolio for a very long time. I know in the past we used to manage like Edgewater Manor, but that the city took over that many years ago. So yeah, it's been many years. So we don't normally acquire new properties. What we're tasked with is just making sure that the public housing units that we do manage currently are kept up to date, that we're leasing it up, that we're maintaining occupancy, because internally, like HUD wants us to maintain a high occupancy. They don't want us to have units sitting unoccupied. So yeah, we haven't built new units. What we did now is like 15 years ago for High Rise Manor, we did a mixed finance deal where we did where we renovated internally all the different apartments. We made some units ADA accessible. So those are things that we may do in the future, is do just more renovations to make sure our units are being kept up to date with the current like housing trends, and just staying up to date, but not necessarily acquiring new units. But like I mentioned, I did go to a conference and just learning about what other housing authorities are doing. So that's something that we could explore in the future potentially, is just looking at creative financing deals that's not necessarily funded by HUD. But that hasn't been our priority in the couple years.
I would assume funds are probably the largest barrier to to purchasing more property.
Yeah, because we are federally funded, so we don't receive any private funds or state funds. All our funds come from the operating fund bucket, and then the capital fund bucket, and that's allocated every year by HUD.
Okay.
So that's a big portion as well.
Again, not so much a question as just naming something. So whether it would be public housing or Section 8, or if somebody had to move, and a lot of folks have emergency housing, and so they can't qualify for either of those two things immediately, and even if they go to Salvation Army. We're talking about folks who are spending a lot of their hours working and or worrying. They're in crisis mode almost 24/7. And now they have to have the capacity to do all the applications and follow through. And so, and that's not going to go away, and I'm not saying it should go away, but I'm saying as we develop these things, we have to have neighborly programs. So like One Big Tent, we get folks who are just like, I have this application, I don't know how to do it, right? Like I'm just overwhelmed, or they're just emotionally overwhelmed, and they got handed a packet from the Salvation Army, and they can't even start. So there has to be some wraparound services, like neighbor services, that also walk along with these people to help them to make all of these transitions, right? Because it's an overwhelming thing if you're in any kind of crisis mode.
Yeah, I was both thinking along the question line that Travis had, but then that brought forward to me on the front end as you're bringing up when someone applies and let's say they're accepted. What is the timeline like if they have a current lease that and they're like maybe they don't want to leave that till it's up, or what kind of is that what you're basically continuously?
Yeah, so we work with people because a lot of times people have to give, we know that people usually have to give a 30-day notice to their current landlord if they're going to be leaving their current place. So we work with people. So if they're interested, we'll hold the apartment if we know that they're leaving their lease. So yeah, once they've reached their name on the waiting list, they pass all the the screening criteria, the things that HUD requires, they have all their documentation and they're ready. The next step is just working with them, determining, when they want to sign the lease and when they want to move in. So in that part, we're flexible because we do know that people usually need to give time.
Yeah.
I would say the biggest hurdle is just documentation, because sometimes things like Social Security or obtaining birth certificate, and that will hold up the process, because you'll be so surprised how many people don't have these documents. You would think, I would think like most people would have their Social Security or birth, but a lot of people, they're like, oh, I don't know where that is. And then you have to be like, okay, you could go here, go to the vital records to be able to obtain it. So that sometimes could be really big hurdles, and that could delay the process because it's not only documentation for themselves, but it's also documentation for any family members that's listed on their application as well.
Yeah.
So those are some of the hurdles that delays the process.
I know you touched on the concept of tiny homes and adding into, having other organizations step in and not gathering the funding. But I don't know if anyone's done research on that. I've been to them in Madison, and I know the person who took over that. And I mean, the price is astronomical. I think it was 21 homes, and I think it went down to 19 homes. But the city gave them $450,000 to get this project started. I believe they had to raise just as much, and it cost $50,000 a year to operate. So it's really expensive. So I know a lot of people push that concept, but I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done before we can even address it by everyone in the room.
Yeah, I agree. And just different models in general.
Yeah, one of the things, you touched a little bit on it, but we have done a number of WIDA projects. The city has, and has incentivized that via TIF financing. The Berkshire Senior Housing Project on Water and Third is a affordable senior housing project that was financed through WIDA. The convent, which will be known as the Grove, is also a WIDA finance project as well. And we continue to work with folks. I think one of the barriers for WIDA is it's a very competitive process. And, there was another LMI project on Arlington and Water. And that project didn't move forward because they weren't able to obtain the WIDA financing. There's short-term gain to going through that route, but there are some long-term liabilities, which includes after I think it's 15 years, you no longer have to maintain it as an affordable housing complex. You could convert it to market rate at that point. And so there are like some of these, I think, longer term threats with some of these major projects that at some point they will no longer be LMI housing or affordable senior housing. It will be market rate again. And so I think that's just kind of something that we've got to start thinking about a little bit more collectively as we, pursue projects with some developers in the city of Stevens Point. One other thing, and I think there's some history here between the Housing Authority and the city, because there's kind of this oddball relationship where the Housing Authority is its own authority. I mean, you folks have a lot of autonomy, and it wasn't always like that. There was a point about a decade ago where the Housing Authority was actually under the Community Development Department, and through some administrative changes at the time. I think the former mayor, Halverson, took that from underneath community development, put it in its own separate compartment. And I don't know, you and I are both new to the city. I don't know if there's a chance to have conversations about rejoining those two departments again and having a conversation about what makes most sense so that there's not this kind of disconnect between what the community development department is doing when it comes to housing and what the housing authority is doing when it comes to housing. And it's not a power move, I promise. I have enough problems with my own department, but I'm just saying, are there ways, because I know the city of Wausau does it that way, where the housing authority, and I believe in Appleton, and I believe the city of Wausau also manages the Section 8 and Section 9 housing for the county.
Here, like I said, I joined, I'm relatively new, almost 2 years in.
Yeah.
But I do know in the past it was part of the city, but both housing authorities are just individual entities that are separate from the city.
Yeah.
But it doesn't hurt to have discussions just to see, they're, maybe both of us could do some digging into what happened in the past. I'm not too sure, but I do know that we have the Portage County that does Section 8, and then you have you guys that do, I guess, affordable housing separate from income-based rent.
And it's interesting because you've got 3 groups that are public entities that all work on housing, but we don't talk. We don't have legitimate conversations. We email, every once in a while. And then when there's a fire, I show up and you're there. So, it's just a kind of a comment, and I've made that to others in the past, where there's got to be a better way for these administratively to function. And is there a way with the city housing authority's knowledge on the actual day-to-day operations, and then, the community development's knowledge on WIDA financing and working through projects, where are we missing or where are we not connecting and adding more LMI housing to the city's housing stock. So,
Ryan, I have a question for you, and it regard not just our city, but municipalities in general. With the new proposed development downtown, something like that, is that something a municipality ever develops and, then takes advantage of those tax credits that are out there and provides, fills a void that maybe a developer wouldn't otherwise? And then that way you're able to tailor some of that with the parking that's required. Is that something municipalities ever do, or do they kind of just stay out of housing?
I wish municipalities would be more aggressive when it came to building housing like that, especially if you have an existing organization like the City Housing Authority that can manage projects like that. But I think it goes back to, they can only build and manage so many based on, HUD ratios as an example. So, in the proposed Shopco redevelopment, which the city applied for a Badger bounce back grant for, that was, the main focus was how do you construct housing that folks who were impacted by COVID-19 are able to reside. And so the thought was, of course, LMI workforce housing. And so just because of, our relationship with some developers, we were pretty active in recruiting, like General Capital, who did Berkshire and the Convent, to say, are you interested in doing a project like this? Because it's pretty intriguing, looking at some of their performance. Some of these developers have almost none of their own money into these projects. They are very active in pursuing the WIDA financing, grants, a TIF incentive as well. So at the end of the day, these projects are heavily subsidized by federal and local governments, and the developer walks into it with almost none of their own cash, which has always just been super intriguing to me, that you can build a $10 million building and make money off of it and have pretty limited liability. But besides that point, the whole thought would be done privately. And if there was a chance to have the City Housing Authority do a project, across the street from the high rise, where the Shopco property is, I think that would make a lot of sense. Just dynamically with the two facilities right there. So long-winded way of answering your question.
Well, to Noah's point, if these developers are doing it with tax credits and TIF money, why can't the city just do it with tax credits and TIF money and leave them out of it, and then they can set the rents?
Yeah, that's something I don't think we've ever really thought of, like, but, and then it goes back to, these developers have,
Who
you
wants
know.
to manage it within the city is also a
Yeah,
question.
and they've got staff, right? I mean, they hire people specifically for grant application and project management, and we just don't have the capacity with the existing city staff to pursue projects like that. And
It's something I would encourage the city to not just write off at face value, though. I think as some landlord, everyone would assume landlords would be opposed to the city getting it, but I think there's a need there that isn't filled by that conventional system, and I would really encourage the city to look into that and see if there's a way to make a development like that feasible, where then you don't have to worry about 15 years from now that switching to market rent.
Yeah.
I mean, you could get the parking garage done the way you want it. I really, especially with a project like that downtown, I would encourage the city to look into that and put some resources in it and try to find a way to make something like that happen.
Yeah.
And with the market rent portion of that, you could hopefully then offset, the city, even outside of the housing authority, may be able to say, look, we're not doing this to make money, so we've got X amount of income over our expenses from our market rate stuff that now we can offset and offer some grants or whatever else to some of that LMI.
Yeah. Yeah, and for those who aren't aware, like the Shopco redevelopment, as I kind of mentioned earlier, the whole purpose and for this bounce back grant that the city applied for is called the Neighborhood Improvement Grant. We would be acquiring the Shopco property, we would be tearing it down, extending Union Street to Main Street, and then creating what are essentially referred to as 4 development pads. 2 would be focused on LMI and workforce housing. 1 would be like a hotel, and then there was another development pad along Main Street that would be a mixed-use building that would be more focused on market rate. But we're over 60% of your land is at least dedicated towards LMI housing, which I think puts us in a really great position to receive some type of grant funding for it.
Well, and I would say that there are interested entities within the city, hopefully all of the faith communities, that would be interested in investing in something like that and partnering with the city, not only just in the investment, but in the wraparound stuff that has to go for that to be sustainable housing.
Yeah, yeah. I know one thing we've talked about, there's the old water tank site on Georgia Street, and we've, since the old giant water tank's gone, but we've been looking at that as a possibility for some tiny house development. It's about 2.5 acres, but again, I think the return, as Tiffany brought up earlier, is just pretty incredible because pretty incredible, like it doesn't exist, because just the sheer cost to get these buildings to today's codes, putting them there, you look at like what possible layouts you can have, it really becomes almost problematic where you wouldn't make anything to even sustain the program itself. So, but there are properties out there that I think we should be more creative on when it comes to affordable housing.
And I'm not sure, one thing I want to point out is that I know CAP Services, they acquire some like single family homes to sell them to like LMI communities, and I don't know what incentives the city can do locally, because I always think, public housing is definitely useful, but if you really are trying to like lift people like out of poverty, I really think like one route is like the home ownership route. But for home ownership to be available to LMI populations, the purchase price needs to be, below market value. So that is not in my realm, but that's just out of just thinking forward and improving people for people to become more economically self-sufficient. I think one avenue is home ownership, and it would be good if there were more single-family homes. I'm not too sure about the condo market or apartment market locally, but if there were more homes that were available to LMI, not just for renting purposes, but for home ownership purposes, I really think that could change the dynamics of LMI populations going forward. Because housing it's good, but it's not necessarily building wealth. So just, separate from my discussion, I would like to see more homeownership opportunities for LMI populations.
And I know James Barrett, who's kind of leads that program for CAP Services, he and I have had some really good conversations about that. And the last few years, just because of the market, it's almost become cost prohibitive for CAP to get in. I know they've done a number of properties in the city, and trying to get properties from like Portage County that are on tax foreclosure, into CAP Services so they can do their rehab and then sell it to LMI individuals so they can build that equity has been really problematic. And I think that's something that internally we recognize that the city and CAP and the county need to work better on is, give the city or CAP Services first kick at the can for some of these like tax foreclosure properties. And give CAP the opportunity to do the rehab. I know they've done a number of homes, especially in the core of the city, that have turned out really good, and we're very pleased with that. So, but that's maybe something we can have James Barrett come and talk about.
Elisa, I saw your hand was raised.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just, I need to leave for another meeting, but all of these ideas are wonderful, and I'm hoping that they'll all be captured in the notes, because I was particularly interested in the conversation coming from Travis, and I'm not sure who is sitting next to him. And I didn't hear all of it. So I'm hoping that's all in the notes so that we can revisit that and maybe see opportunities for subcommittees on drilling down on some of this. So thank you.
So I have, tell me if I'm right or wrong, like create apartments at market rate instead of using a developer, use city funds so that it can't change over after 8-10 years to a market rate apartment. It already is, but it's subsidized for low-income people through the city and HUD.
Yep. And Melissa, it's Noah Aschenbach sitting here.
Oh, thanks, Noah. I didn't recognize your voice quite like Travis's. I recognize Travis's. I don't know if that's good or bad, Travis.
Probably not good.
I don't poke my head out as much as Travis does.
Yeah. He is a vocal gentleman, so there's nothing wrong with that. But thank you for reading back. All of these ideas are just really great, and I think we're drilling down on some of these and creating opportunities is why our chairperson and I worked on this with Director Karnowski. It just warms my heart. So thank you.
Any other thoughts, questions from anyone?
I just, for the city's housing authority, do you have an estimate of tenants that are part of the IDD community that are within the housing authority?
The disabled? Disabled, yeah, I put, 1 second.
Was it on there?
It was like 25.
Yeah, it was
About a
like
quarter,
25
okay.
of all tenants.
Probably wasn't paying it much attention.
Yeah,
My
so
apologies.
25% are considered
Okay.
disabled.
Okay.
And this is for all the tenants.
And the average income, that's taking all your tenants. If you were to break out the people that are on SSI or disability, do you have an average, and you probably don't have it with you, but do you have an average income for the people who are outside of that group? Like the people who are gainfully employed, what their income
Yeah,
level is?
we could always separate, I don't know that number, off my head, but in our data, we could always separate. You're talking about non-fixed income, what the averages for non-fixed income. Yeah, we could get that, but I'm not aware of that number right now, yeah. But that's a good question, to separate
I think it'd
non-fixed
be a
income.
little easier then to take a look at with where employment is going now and, just kind of gauge where some of that puts other people at.
On that note, my
Yeah,
voice is a little tired.
Yeah, the average income is far lower than I thought it would be, just given the income restrictions that you have, and that was just one thing that kind of stuck out.
Yeah, because one thing that we recently sent out a mailing, you may be familiar, was the holiday basket. I'm not sure if you do that. So we sent out, and they needed to meet the 200% pot. And we were like, because I asked my administrative, assistant to look at the data and send it out. It was like, most of our tenants were actually eligible to receive the holiday basket that I think it's with energy services and CAP services. So that means they were, meet the federal poverty guidelines. So we looked at that recently and we're like, okay, so they're much lower than the county area media income.
Well, I really appreciate everyone's time and thoughts and questions today. Yeah, my experience in the previous community working with their continuum of care, which was putting all of the emergency crisis housing along with public and halfway houses and shelters. I think that this is such a critical component of getting people to that home ownership and building wealth and a stabilized community. So I really appreciate sharing your perspective for that.
Thank you.
Have those questions? Yeah. I think we're adjourned then for today.
Thank you.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.